On December 29, 1999, two 16-year-old girls vanished in Welch, Oklahoma. A fire consumed the Harper family trailer. One body was found, two were not. Police wrote no evidence of foul play, but accelerant residue marked the floor. A bullet fragment gleamed in a skull, and a soot footprint stopped at the doorway. For the next 18 years, officials insisted there were no answers, only a mother's ledger, shoeboxes of evidence, and a scarf preserved the truth. In 2018, a suspect finally stood trial, but the girls never returned. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The night of December 29th in Welch, Oklahoma, settled in cold and clear. Thin frost coated the metal siding of the Harper trailer, reflecting the pale moonlight inside. Faint laughter mixed with the static of a television. Emily Harper, 16, and her best friend, Claire Benton, also 16, had gathered after a birthday dinner. On the counter sat a cake with its candles already melted down to wax puddles. A Polaroid camera lay nearby, film still warm from earlier pictures. At 5 minutes past midnight, neighbors noticed a sudden glow rising behind the tree line. By 12:10, flames roared through the trailer's thin walls, snapping windows outward in bursts of glass. A call to the county fire station logged the emergency at 12:14 a.m. The first truck arrived at 12:28. By then, the structure had collapsed inward, beams falling into the blaze like brittle matchsticks. Firefighters pulled the remains of Kathy Harper from what had been the back bedroom. The official report logged her as charred beyond recognition. Identified by dental plate, Emily and Claire were not found. Sheriff's deputies arriving on scene suggested they had escaped into the woods or burned completely away. Their absence was written in official ink as unconfirmed survival. Sarah Benton arrived before dawn. She was Claire's mother, still in her nightclothes, clutching her daughter's denim jacket. The deputies offered vague reassurances. Sarah asked again and again, "Where are the girls?" No one answered. By 7 a.m., the fire marshal sifted through ash with a rake, placing fragments into buckets, among them flooring samples blackened but distinct. He noted chemical odor inconsistent with wood smoke. Later, testing revealed accelerant residue. That detail was filed quietly and never spoken of again in public briefings. The county coroner examined the remains of Emily's father, Jack Harper, whose body was also recovered. An entry in the autopsy log read, "Thermal damage with cranial fracture." A photograph taken before cremation showed a small metallic glint embedded near the skull's base. No bullets were collected. The case file marked cause of death as fire-related injuries. By afternoon, television crews lined the county road. Reporters spoke of teen runaways, speculating about conflict at home. The Harper property was roped with yellow tape, but local boys slipped through to collect souvenirs, melted coins, broken glass, a half-burned notebook cover. One boy later turned over a shoe sole he found in the field size 6. Tread partially burned. It was bagged but never entered into evidence logs. At 9 p.m., deputies released the scene. Neighbors watched as the last fire truck left. Sarah Benton stood alone, staring at the skeletal frame of the trailer. In the dirt near the front steps, she noticed a mark pressed into soot, the outline of a shoe print, larger than her daughter's, stopping at the doorframe and going no further. That night she took a photograph of the mark with a disposable camera. Days later, when she developed the roll, she pinned the picture to her refrigerator. The deputies never asked for it. Sarah's questions spread through Welch. Where did the girls go? Why was accelerant found on the floorboards? Who pressed the footprint into soot at the broken doorframe? The county sheriff gave a single statement to the press. There is no evidence of foul play. After that, silence. But in Sarah's kitchen, the photograph of the sootprint hung like a shadow, a reminder of presence where there should have been escape. The case began with absence, recorded in cold entries and burned remains. But the first clue was already visible, stamped black into the doorway. A footprint in soot stopped at the trailer's broken doorframe. The morning after the fire, the Harper property looked less like a home than a ruin. Frost clung to twisted metal beams, and black smoke still curled from the wreckage. The sheriff's office posted no guards. By mid-morning, neighbors and volunteers had walked freely through the ash. Sarah Benton arrived with her brother, Daniel. She carried a spiral notebook and a pen, deciding that if no one else would keep records, she would. The first entry she wrote was time 9:42 a.m. Trailer cold to touch. Fire investigators focused on the rear where Kathy Harper's body had been pulled. Deputies lingered near their cars. No one examined the perimeter. Sarah, Daniel, and 2 volunteers began their own survey. They sifted through piles with gloved hands, marking finds with strips of masking tape. By noon, Sarah had logged fragments, melted jewelry, twisted hinges, half of a diary cover. She wrapped each in plastic and labeled them with times. Near the living room, she uncovered a wristwatch with its face cracked but still faintly ticking. The deputies dismissed it as irrelevant. Daniel spotted a series of impressions in the mud behind the trailer. They ran toward the gravel road, parallel grooves from a truck tire. He pressed his boot next to one and realized the tread was deeper than his. A volunteer fetched plaster, pouring a mold. Sarah recorded the detailed tracks running north, not documented by deputies. At 1 p.m., a neighbor brought over a shoe he had found at the edge of the woods. It was small, a white sneaker scorched at the heel. Laces gone, inside the tongue. The faded label showed size 6. Sarah set it in a paper bag. Writing possible Claire, the deputies glanced, shrugged, and walked away. Reporters crowded the roadside by afternoon. Their questions revolved around rumors, drugs, fights, teenagers leaving home. Sarah refused to speak. Instead, she taped a missing poster to the fence post, Claire Benton. 16 last seen at Harper residence, Emily Harper. 16 missing. She wrote the date at the bottom, underlined twice, in the days that followed. The Benton family returned daily. Sarah's notebook filled with entries, scorched diary fragment, Polaroid frame melted on one side, bones too small to belong to adults, but dismissed by officials as animal. She gathered what she could, storing items in shoeboxes in her living room. On January 4th, Sarah noticed something others had overlooked. The tire tracks behind the trailer had a distinctive pattern, wide gaps between ridges. Unlike the standard pickup trucks in the county, she contacted the sheriff's office and asked for comparison records. Weeks later, she received a single page stating no match with registered vehicles. The plaster cast remained in her possession. She wrapped it in a towel and hid it in her pantry, next to bags of flour and sugar. By mid-January, volunteers expanded the search outward. Fields, barns, and culverts within 10 miles were combed. Dogs alerted near the riverbank once, but deputies claimed it was animal scent. Sarah wrote in her notebook, dogs tracked north. Ignored. One evening, as temperatures dropped below freezing, Daniel found a half-melted charm bracelet in the ash pile. He recognized it from Claire's birthday weeks earlier. The clasp was broken, the silver links fused together. Sarah placed it in a plastic bag, pressing it flat between notebook pages. The local newspaper ran a headline on January 12th. 2 girls still missing after trailer fire. The article repeated the sheriff's statement: no evidence of kidnapping, possibility of runaway not ruled out. Sarah clipped the page, circled the words runaway in red pen, and stapled it to her notebook. Rumors spread through Welch. Some said the girls had staged their disappearance. Others whispered they had been taken by dealers who frequented the Harper home. Sarah listened but refused to entertain speculation. She had evidence fragments, prints, tracks. What she lacked was acknowledgement. By February, her living room resembled a small archive. Shoeboxes lined the shelves, each labeled by date. One box held plaster casts, another contained paper bags of scorched objects. On her coffee table lay photographs from the disposable camera she carried everywhere. She began pinning them to a corkboard. The soot footprint from the front steps sat at the center. Surrounded by string lines, she added herself. She marked a section unreturned. Items deputies had taken and never brought back: melted Polaroid, suspected bone fragments, strands of blonde hair caught in insulation. She wrote each in capital letters, crossing them with heavy black ink. Claire's father, Mark Benton, tried to remain practical. He suggested waiting for police reports. Sarah refused. She told him, every day they delay. The trail cools. Her voice was flat, not emotional like she was reading a report out loud. By spring, searches dwindled, deputies stopped visiting, but Sarah's notebook only grew. She logged phone calls from strangers, tips from neighbors, even sightings later proven false. Each entry began with a time and date, ending with a dash for status unresolved. The tire track cast remained untouched in her pantry, its ridges sharp in plaster. One night she pulled it out and placed it beside the size 6 sneaker. She traced both with her finger, then closed the box again. When she flipped through her notebook months later, the January entry caught her eye. Tracks running north, not documented by deputies. She underlined it in fresh ink. The tread matched no vehicle listed in county records. By summer of 2000, the Harper fire was spoken of less as tragedy and more as rumor. The official case files had stalled. Deputies shifted resources elsewhere, in Welch, cafes, and feed stores. Theories multiplied. Some claimed Emily and Claire had run away to Tulsa. Others whispered that Emily's father, Jack Harper, had enemies who wanted him silenced. The Benton family refused to let the case fade. Sarah Benton's notebook was now thick with clippings, receipts, and handwritten witness statements. She taped entries across her kitchen wall until it resembled an evidence board in the center. She pinned a photocopy of Jack Harper's autopsy. The document noted thermal injuries extensive, but also contained one overlooked line metallic fragment embedded in occipital region. The pathologist had described it without collecting it. A single blurred photograph showed the glint in the skull cavity. Sarah circled the line in red. Daniel pressed the sheriff for explanation. The answer was curt damage from fire collapse. Not ballistic, but Daniel had hunted long enough to recognize the outline of a bullet fragment. He photocopied the page and added it to Sarah's archive. Attention shifted briefly toward Jack Harper. Some neighbors believed he had killed Kathy, burned the trailer, and fled with Emily and Claire. That theory collapsed when testing confirmed his own death inside the fire. Others accused Kathy of involvement in drug debts. Every rumor left wounds in families already frayed. One night, Sarah received an anonymous call logged at 9:17 p.m. A male voice whispered, "They didn't burn, they were taken." Then the line cut. Phone company trace showed it came from a payphone outside a truck stop on Highway 69. Deputies made no follow-up. Sarah logged the date and time anyway. In August, a local teenager told police he saw two men near the Harper property days before the fire. He described an old Ford truck with primer patches on the door. Deputies wrote it off as unreliable witness. Sarah clipped the statement from her copy of the report and taped it to her board beside the tire track photo. Claire's cousin, Melissa, handed Sarah a Polaroid she found under Claire's bed while cleaning. It showed Emily and Claire laughing, taken hours before the fire, on the back. Claire had written, "Best night of the year." The photo smelled faintly of smoke, as though it had been near the fire but not inside. Sarah placed it in a protective sleeve. By late fall, another rumor spread. The girls were seen in Joplin, Missouri. With older men, police sent a faxed flyer to surrounding counties. No confirmation followed. The case remained open, stagnant. Inside the Benton home, Claire's bedroom was preserved. Posters still lined the walls, her school books stacked on the desk. Sarah kept the door closed, entering only to dust. On the dresser, a jewelry box still held half a set of silver earrings. The other half, Sarah realized, was the melted piece she had collected from the fire site. She bagged it and labeled it "pair matched." On November 3rd, a hunter stumbled across bone fragments in a field 6 miles north. Deputies collected them, then announced they were from deer. No written lab confirmation was ever provided. Sarah wrote in her notebook, "Bones dismissed without proof." By winter, theories turned harsher. Some locals accused the Bentons of clinging to false hope. Others insisted Emily had drawn Claire into trouble. Sarah responded with silence. Her notes told her more than rumors ever could. She pinned one last photograph to her board before Christmas, the autopsy image of Jack Harper's skull. Underneath, she wrote 3 words in block letters, "Not fire damage." The skull fracture was older than the flames that hid it. In the spring of 2001, months after the fire had been pushed to the margins of public memory, a farmer named Harold Dugan drove his tractor across a fallow stretch of land near an abandoned well 15 miles outside Welch at 4 in the afternoon, while clearing brush. His plow caught on something soft and charred. He climbed down and pulled free a small leather purse, its seams blackened by heat. Inside were scraps, a warped driver's license, half a notebook page, coins fused together. The license carried Claire Benton's name. The photograph, though darkened by smoke, still revealed her eyes staring back. Harold phoned the sheriff's office. A deputy collected the purse, logged it as possible planted item, and placed it on a shelf. Within a week it was released back to Harold, who handed it directly to Sarah Benton. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, gloves on, and emptied the contents carefully. She catalogued each piece in her notebook. She laid the driver's license flat between sheets of wax paper. The notebook scrap bore warped lines, ink blurred but still legible in patches. A single sentence read, "We can't leave until the rest had melted away." Sarah pressed the fragment into a sleeve and labeled it with date, time, and location on her evidence board. She pinned the purse beside Claire's missing poster. The photo of her daughter on the ID now looked back at the Polaroid taken hours before the fire. 2 versions of Claire, joined by ash. Reporters caught wind of the find and published short articles. Officials repeated their line, No evidence connecting this to foul play. Sarah, however, insisted the purse was proof the girls had been taken from the Harper property. It didn't burn in that trailer, she told anyone who asked. It was carried away. Volunteers began searching around the abandoned well where the purse had been found. They unearthed beer cans, broken glass, and a rusted chain. One man claimed to see a faint outline of a shoe impression near the soil, but by then rain had washed away any clear definition. Sarah logged the report anyway. She requested the sheriff's office test the notebook scrap for handwriting. Weeks later, she received a brief letter sample too damaged for conclusive analysis. She compared it herself to letters Claire had written in school. The slant of the capital C was identical. She made a note, confirmed. Despite report, Sarah began carrying the purse with her to vigils and meetings. She pinned it to her board at night, then unpinned it by morning. It became a symbolic object proof of presence outside the fire zone. She told her brother, "This is the tether." They tried to erase it, but it stayed. The Benton family organized a private search party in June. Volunteers spread out across the fields surrounding the well, walking shoulder to shoulder. They carried flags to mark any finds. By sundown, they had flagged 4 sites: a scrap of flannel shirt, a belt buckle, a clump of blonde hair snagged in barbed wire, and the handle of a plastic camera. Deputies accepted only the shirt scrap into custody. Sarah kept the rest, labeling each in her notebook. The blonde hair she wrapped in tissue, placing it in a jar on her mantel. She stared at it nightly, certain it matched her daughter's shade. Years later, testing would never be performed. Sarah's archive grew heavier. She added the purse, the notebook fragment, the blonde hair, the belt buckle. Shoeboxes multiplied. Her corkboard lines grew thicker, stretching from the soot footprint photo to the tire cast, to the purse pinned under glass. She began to think of it less as a board and more as a map of what others refused to see. One evening, while sorting papers, she noticed the handwriting on the notebook fragment. The ink warped, but still revealed the start of a signature. The first 3 letters of Claire's name curved faintly across the bottom corner. Sarah outlined them in pencil to preserve the shape. To her, it was not just evidence, it was voice through fire. At community meetings, officials repeated their phrases: runaway, planted evidence, unreliable leads. Sarah held the purse up before them, shaking it gently so the coins rattled. "This is not planted," she said. "This is my daughter's life, dropped in a field you don't want to look at." Her words were ignored, but the purse remained. It hung in her kitchen, suspended on a nail beside the Polaroid. Visitors would stop, look, and fall silent. The fragments of Claire's life began to echo in ordinary objects. The scarf she once wore was folded on her bed. The bracelet Sarah had pulled from the ash matched an earring in the jewelry box. The notebook scrap now sat preserved in plastic. The community moved on, but Sarah could not. She pinned her daughter's license photo on top of the evidence board, above every other piece. The eyes stared out across scorched fragments. String and soot. The ink warped. But her name still bled through the page. In October 2002, nearly 3 years after the Harper fire, Sarah Benton received a phone call just after 6 in the evening. The voice belonged to a man she barely knew, a farmhand named Lewis Crane. He said he had information but did not want to go to the sheriff. His words were slow, cautious. "There's a place they used, a cellar, out near the old McCary land." Sarah wrote the name in her notebook, underlined it twice. The McCarys were cousins, known in town for drifting through drug networks. They had left the county months before the fire. Deputies had questioned them once, then dropped the matter. 2 days later, Sarah, her brother Daniel, and a small group of volunteers drove out to the property. The farmhouse was collapsing, windows broken, doors swinging on rusted hinges. Behind it, an old root cellar lay half hidden beneath weeds. Its wooden hatch creaked when Daniel forced it open. The air that rose carried dampness and decay. They descended by flashlight at the base. Stone walls dripped with condensation. The beam caught scraps on the ground, a length of rope. Frayed and stained, a Polaroid photograph bent and torn, shards of glass scattered across dirt. Daniel bent down and lifted the rope. Its fibers were darkened, stiff. Sarah bagged it in plastic, writing binding on a strip of tape. Near the far wall, they found something stranger, a glass jar sealed tight. Inside it, strands of blonde hair coiled like thread. Sarah's breath slowed. She placed it gently into a bag. The torn Polaroid showed the outline of a young girl, seated, eyes turned toward the flash. The image was degraded, warped by damp. But the frame and border matched the type Claire once used in her own camera. Sarah tucked it into an envelope. The cellar's dirt floor bore impressions, shallow but discernible, heel marks and scuffs. Someone had moved heavily here. Sarah knelt, pressed her palm against one. She felt the shape of a soul. Back on the surface, she called the sheriff's office. A deputy arrived after an hour, took the bagged items, and scribbled brief notes. He promised testing, promised follow-up. Then he left. Months passed. Sarah inquired weekly. The deputy claimed results were pending. Eventually, he stopped returning her calls. When she visited the sheriff's office, the items were not in evidence lockers. She wrote in her notebook, rope, Polaroid, jar unreturned. The volunteers who had been with her began to doubt. They spoke quietly, some saying the cellar find was coincidence, others fearing retaliation. But Sarah persisted. She added sketches of the basement to her archive, labeling each corner and marking where the objects had lain. One night, unable to sleep, she replayed the memory of the Polaroid. She described it in writing: girl with hair covering right eye, blurred figure behind, flash reflection on wall. She taped the description beneath Claire's missing poster. Daniel worried. "They'll call it speculation," he said. Sarah replied, "Then let them. But I won't erase it." By 2003, the cellar was padlocked by new owners. The McCary cousins were said to be in Kansas, drifting between motels. Deputies made no effort to locate them. Sarah held on to the memory of the jar. Its hair was pale, fine, unmistakably female. She had touched the glass, felt its coldness, before handing it away. That sensation lingered longer than any official report. At church vigils, she spoke sparingly, but always ended with the same line: they were taken. They were kept. I have seen where. Her words unsettled some, but others began to believe. The image of a basement, with rope, photographs, and hair sealed in glass, took root in community whispers. Sarah pinned a new section to her board. She titled it The Basement. Underneath, she placed sketches, her written description, and a copy of her police report. In the center, she taped a slip of paper with 3 words, in capital letters: evidence vanished again. The jar became more than a lost object. It became a symbol of how truth itself could be sealed away, only to disappear in custody. Every night she looked at her board. following the string lines from soot footprint to tire cast, from purse to notebook fragment, from Polaroid to vanished jar. Each clue pointed outward, away from fire, into the darkness of structures no one wanted to face. The community grew quieter, officials more dismissive, but Sarah's archive grew, box by box. The jar vanished into an evidence room no one entered again. In late 2004, 5 years after the Harper fire, Sarah Benton's niece was helping clean Claire's old bedroom. Behind a stack of school binders at the bottom of the closet, she found a spiral-bound notebook with a warped blue cover. Dust filmed its surface, but the pages inside remained intact. She handed it to Sarah, who laid it carefully on the kitchen table. The journal spanned the year leading up to the fire. Claire's handwriting was neat at first, looping letters pressed with confidence. The early entries were ordinary school notes, movie outings, fragments of conversations with Emily. But as Sarah turned the pages, the tone shifted. Entries began mentioning names of older men who visited the Harper property. She listed license plate numbers, scrawled hurriedly in margins. One page noted white truck with dented bumper comes at night, plates 9 to 4B7. Another red pickup with broken taillight, plate 7D1. Claire circled the numbers, as though intending to remember them later. Sarah recognized the instinct. Her daughter had been watching, recording, even when no one else thought to. By mid-journal, Claire's words grew sharper. Fighting with Dad again. Says she's scared of the people who come around. They laugh at me when I write. Told me to put it away. Then an entry 2 weeks before the fire saw a photo roll in Harper drawer. Didn't belong to them. Pictures of others. Didn't know what to do, if anything happens. Look at the sentence ended abruptly, the ink smeared by a line of water damage. Sarah stared at it, whispering the unfinished words. She cross-checked the license plates with DMV records, filing requests under her name. The responses came slowly, each on thick government paper. 2 plates belonged to trucks later reported stolen and destroyed in scrapyards. One had been owned by a McCary cousin, the same family linked to the basement property. Sarah logged each response in her notebook, adding copies to her evidence board. She called the sheriff's office with her findings. The deputy on duty told her plates no longer valid, nothing actionable. Sarah asked if they would at least run fingerprints from the journal. She was told funding was unavailable. Instead, she began comparing the handwriting to school essays Claire had written. The slant matched, the loops consistent. She invited Claire's English teacher, Mrs. Danner, to view the journal. The teacher confirmed it. This is Claire's hand. No doubt. Sarah logged her statement, dated and signed. The journal became centerpiece of the Benton archive. Sarah placed it in a plastic sleeve, then in a fireproof box under her bed. She opened it nightly, tracing the last unfinished sentence. Meanwhile, rumors grew in Welch. Some said the journal was forged. Others claimed Sarah had planted it to keep attention alive. Officials dismissed it as teen writing without relevance. But Sarah persisted. She began speaking at vigils with the journal in her hand. Claire recorded what she saw. She told the crowd, "She left us this." The words spread, becoming part of the case's lore. By 2006, Sarah and Daniel compiled all license plate numbers from the journal into a spreadsheet. They compared them with wreckage logs at scrapyards across Oklahoma and Kansas. 3 matched vehicles listed as destroyed by fire within months after the Harper blaze. Daniel drove to one of the yards, finding only twisted metal remains. He collected a fragment of a plate, its paint still faintly red. he brought it back, and Sarah logged it in her shoebox archive. One night, Sarah reread the entry about the photo roll. She remembered the Polaroid from the basement, blurred and water-stained. The connection tightened. Claire had seen images, and those images had reappeared in fragments years later. She pinned the two notes side by side. As the years passed, the journal became both anchor and burden. Sarah's handwriting filled her own notebooks, mirroring her daughter's obsessive recording. Visitors noticed the similarity. Some whispered that Sarah had become as haunted as the evidence itself. In 2010, she submitted the journal to a private forensic examiner. The report came back confirming handwriting authenticity and suggesting partial DNA could be lifted from the smudged ink. The examiner highlighted fingerprints in the margins, at least two distinct sets. One smaller, one larger. Sarah offered the report to authorities. It was logged, then ignored. The journal returned to her possession. She placed it back under her bed, wrapped in cloth. Over time, she memorized its passages, able to recite entire entries. She spoke them in interviews, on television, at vigils. The words became incantations, fragments of truth recited against silence. The final page haunted her most. Ink running, unfinished sentence trailing off into smear. She imagined Claire interrupted mid-word. Pen dropping, she replayed the image in her mind, her daughter writing, hearing a noise, looking up. Sarah copied the line onto index cards and taped them throughout her house. On the refrigerator, beside her bed, on the dashboard of her car, if anything happens. Look at... Her obsession extended to every lead. She tracked down former neighbors, asked them about trucks with primer doors and broken taillights. Some confirmed, some denied. Most stayed silent. She filed every response. By 2012, her board had become an archive wall stretching across her living room. Strings connected soot footprint, purse, basement jar, and now the journal. She titled the section Claire's Record. Her brother worried. "You're building a house of ghosts," he told her. Sarah answered, "No, I'm building a record they can't erase." And still, at the center of it all, the unfinished sentence. 3 license plates, 3 trucks destroyed, 3 initials circled in ink. 3 plates belonged to trucks burned months later in scrapyards. By 2014, nearly 15 years had passed since the fire. The Benton archive had grown into something larger than one family's obsession. Boxes filled closets, shelves buckled under binders, and Sarah's living room wall was now a collage of photographs, string, and pinned documents. At its center hung the journal, flanked by the soot footprint and tire cast. Around the edges, names circled in heavy marker. At the top were 3 Roy Bissett, Leon McCary, and Calvin McCary. They were men known in Welch not for steady jobs or family ties, but for drifting between trailers, living on cash, and carrying reputations for violence. In the months before the fire, they had been seen at the Harper property more than once. Witnesses remembered offhand comments, fragments of bravado. One man told Sarah that Bissett once boasted about pictures of girls no one would ever find. The statement was never logged officially, but Sarah recorded it in her notebook, complete with date and time. The McCary cousins had a history with meth trafficking. Arrest records showed charges for possession, distribution, and violent altercations, yet none had served more than brief sentences. Deputies spoke of them in hushed tones, as though mentioning their names risked reprisal. Sarah reached out to a retired private investigator, Walter Hensley. He agreed to review the Benton archive, after weeks of study. He told her, "You've built a case stronger than anything in those files downtown." He mapped connections between suspects and vehicles listed in Claire's journal. One plate tied directly to a red truck registered briefly in Leon McCary's name, reported stolen and destroyed 3 months after the fire. Walter also uncovered court records linking Bissett to a violent assault in Tulsa in the late 1990s. The description of the victim, a teenage girl, was sealed. But fragments of testimony suggested photographs had been taken. Sarah added this to her wall, pinning it under the heading Pattern. Anonymous tips trickled in. One came through a hotline in 2015, later transcribed in a police call log. The caller's voice, male, hesitant, said, "I saw the pictures." They passed them around. The girls were in them. Then silence. Sarah requested the recording. She received only the transcript. She pinned it beside the Polaroid from the basement. Deputies dismissed the call as rumor. But for Sarah, it confirmed what she already feared, that Claire and Emily had been photographed, their captivity documented and traded like currency. In interviews, Bissett denied involvement, calling the accusations witch hunt nonsense. The McCary cousins had vanished from Welch, drifting through Kansas and Missouri. Records placed them at motels under false names, yet every time Sarah pressed law enforcement for action, the response was the same: insufficient evidence. The Benton family's search grew into community effort. Volunteers collected statements from those too afraid to approach police. Some remembered parties at the McCary property, where young girls were invited and drugs passed freely. Others recalled seeing Emily Harper in the company of older men weeks before the fire. One witness described an argument outside the Harper trailer days before the blaze. He remembered Leon McCary shouting, Emily crying, and a neighbor calling deputies who never arrived. Sarah wrote it down, underlining the words, "never arrived." By now, Sarah's wall was less about speculation and more about structure. The suspects were no longer shadows. They had histories, connections, and patterns that pointed consistently toward the night of the fire. Walter drafted a formal report. Binding it in blue covers, he submitted copies to state investigators and federal offices. Weeks passed, then months. No response came. Sarah began to suspect not incompetence, but deliberate neglect. She marked a new section on her wall, "Ignored Leads." Under it, she pinned the autopsy fragment with bullet glint, the tire cast unmatched, the Polaroid unreturned, the blonde hair vanished, the journal entries dismissed. At the bottom, she taped the transcript of the anonymous call. The call log was simple, a single paragraph. Anonymous male, 9:43 p.m. Caller states he saw photographs of missing girls passed among suspects. Caller hangs up abruptly. No identification obtained. The words carried no emotion, but Sarah read them aloud to herself. Voice flat, as if repeating a forensic record. "I saw the pictures." The phrase became a refrain. She wrote it across index cards, tucked them into her notebooks, taped them beside her bed. For Sarah, it was confirmation that her daughter's suffering had been documented, and that somewhere those documents still existed. In community meetings, she no longer pleaded for help. She presented evidence, listing dates, plates, names. She held up the journal and the transcript. "You may call it rumor," she said, "but the call log is official." They admitted it in their own records. Still, silence from authorities. The suspects lived freely, their names known but untested in court. Sarah's wall, however, told a different story to her. The connections were undeniable. And at its center, The voice from the call log, whispering through the years. The caller's voice cracked as he whispered, "I saw the pictures." By 2016, Sarah Benton had begun to suspect that silence was not neglect, but design. Too many items had disappeared. Too many files had been thinned until only scraps remained. What began as oversight now looked deliberate. She filed repeated requests under Oklahoma's open records law. What she received were packets of photocopies, each page heavy with black rectangles. Witness names vanished behind ink. Vehicle descriptions reduced to unidentified truck. Phone numbers replaced with blank white space. One report in particular unsettled her. It was the initial fire investigation, stamped January 2000. The copy she received in 2016 bore long black bars over the sections describing accelerant residue. The laboratory's original phrase petroleum distillate detected in flooring sample was gone. Only the line number remained. She compared it with the version she had photocopied years earlier. Before the file disappeared into the sheriff's archive, she taped both to her wall side by side, one intact, one smothered in ink. Daniel muttered, "They're hiding their own mistakes." Sarah shook her head. "Not mistakes. Choices." Volunteers who had worked the early searches began stepping back, fearing retaliation. Some whispered that deputies were connected to suspects through narcotics debts. Others said files had been altered to shield informants. Sarah recorded every rumor, but labeled them carefully unconfirmed. She insisted on drawing the line between speculation and evidence. Yet the evidence of suppression was growing. When she requested the Polaroid found in the McCary basement, she was told the item could not be located. When she asked about the jar containing blonde hair, the custodian claimed no record existed. When she pressed for chain of custody on the purse, officials said it had never entered evidence, though she still had the receipt signed by a deputy. She created a new ledger titled Vanished. Each page bore an item rope: Polaroid, jar, hair, purse log. She left wide margins for notes. By the end of the year, half the pages were filled. At a county commission meeting in March, Sarah stood with the ledger in her hand. She read aloud the missing entries. Voice steady. "These are not rumors. These are documented, then erased. My daughter's case has been redacted into absence." Commissioners shifted uncomfortably, eyes down. No response followed. Walter, the retired investigator, warned her, "You're pressing against walls they don't want moved." She answered flatly, "Then I'll press harder." Her archive wall now included a section labeled Cover-Up. She taped the redacted reports in a grid, black ink filling the spaces like wounds. She drew lines to connect them with the vanished evidence. At the center, she wrote one surname in bold, M. Carey. It was the name most frequently buried under redactions. By summer, she began noticing cars idling near her home at night. Phone calls would arrive with no voice on the line. Once, she found her mailbox pried open, papers scattered across the street. None of her shoebox archives were touched, but the message was clear. Still, she persisted. She scanned every document, mailed copies to trusted allies, stored backups in safe deposit boxes. She would not let the record disappear again. In September, she received a letter from the State Attorney General's office. It acknowledged her complaints, but stated, "Due to statute limitations and lack of prosecutable evidence, further inquiry will not proceed." The envelope contained no return address beyond a generic office stamp. Sarah taped the letter to her wall, writing across it in red, "They closed it without asking." Daniel worried for her safety. "You're fighting people who erase paper trails for a living," he said. Sarah's reply was unshaken. I have built a trail they cannot burn. Her wall was less about solving the case now than about resisting its erasure. Each blacked-out name, each vanished object, each ignored call, all were preserved, catalogued, displayed. She called it a record of silence. At a vigil marking 17 years since the fire, Sarah carried the ledger with her. She opened it before the crowd, showing page after page of vanished evidence. The candles flickered in the wind, casting shadows across the ink. "This is what we face," she told them. Not only the men who took them, but the system that let them disappear twice, first in life, then in record. The words spread, carried by those who still cared, whispered by those who feared saying them too loudly. The phrase "twice disappeared" began appearing on posters and flyers. Inside her home, the cover-up section grew denser, documents layered over documents until the wall seemed painted in black ink. Each rectangle was not only a redaction, but a presence, proof of something once there, and in the center of it all, one name barely visible behind ink, but legible enough to remain. Behind the ink, the lines still spelled a single surname. By 2017, Sarah Benton's search had stretched beyond Welch. The trail of names and numbers in her ledger pointed outward, into highways that stitched Oklahoma to Kansas and Missouri. The McCary cousins were not ghosts wandering alone. They were pieces of something wider, a network that thrived in small towns, feeding on silence and fear. Sarah's files now included copies of narcotics indictments pulled from county courts across the region. The same surnames surfaced repeatedly, appearing on both sides of the state line: McCary, Bissett, Carver, Dupree. Arrests were made, sentences served, but the connections endured. She pinned maps to her wall. String stretched between towns, Welch to Baxter Springs, Veneta to Parsons, Tulsa to Joplin. Each pin marked a location where one of the names appeared. An informant, a former dealer arrested in Kansas, told federal agents that the McCarys had once kept trophies photographs of girls used to intimidate rivals or secure debts. The claim surfaced in a sealed deposition. Sarah obtained a summary through a sympathetic contact. She underlined the word trophies until the paper tore. In another file, she found evidence of coded entries in a seized ledger. The book, recovered during a 2009 narcotics raid in Veneta, listed initials and amounts. One entry caught Sarah's eye, EB 500. She believed it referred to Emily Harper's initials, paired with a dollar figure. Officials dismissed it as unrelated. Sarah taped the photocopy to her wall, circled in red. She began to suspect that her daughter's case was not a single event, but part of a pattern. Girls disappeared, rumors of photographs surfaced, and silence followed. Welch was simply one point in a larger circuit. Walter, the retired investigator, agreed. These men were not just criminals. He said, they were part of a trade, and once you're in that trade, people protect each other. He helped Sarah cross-reference vehicle plates from Claire's journal against narcotics arrests. At least 2 overlapped. Community whispers grew darker. People spoke of tapes, of images exchanged as payment. Some mentioned basements like the McCary cellar scattered across rural properties. Sarah listened without flinching, recording every detail, filing it in her ledgers. One night, she unfolded a copy of a 2010 federal affidavit describing meth operations tied to Welch, buried deep in the text. She found mention of collateral material seized but not described. She pinned the phrase to her wall. Writing beside it Polaroids. Her home now resembled an archive more than a residence. Boxes of files lined hallways. Her refrigerator held only essentials, the rest of the space was filled with binders. Every evening she sat at her table, reviewing, cross-checking, adding. The local sheriff's office no longer returned her calls. When reporters visited, they described her as relentless, even obsessive. Sarah accepted the words. Obsession was the only reason the case still breathed. In March of that year, she presented her findings to federal agents in Tulsa. She carried 2 boxes, one labeled Network, the other Vanished. The agents listened politely, took notes, then told her they would review. Months later, she received a letter thanking her for her dedication, but stating that no new investigation would proceed. Daniel read the letter aloud and then tore it in half. Sarah taped the pieces to her wall anyway. For her, even rejection was evidence. The ledger from Veneta remained the most haunting artifact. Its pages, filled with coded initials and numbers, hinted at a system of exchange that reduced lives to currency. Sarah stared at the entry EB 500, unable to erase the connection in her mind. She pressed her hand against the photocopy as though feeling the weight of what it implied. In vigils, she spoke less about individual suspects and more about the structure that allowed them to operate. This is not about 3 men, she told the crowd. This is about a network that uses our silence as shelter. Her words carried, repeated in articles and whispered in small towns across the county. The case was no longer only about 2 missing girls. It had become a symbol of everything that disappeared into the gaps of rural law enforcement, everything erased behind redactions, everything traded in shadows. And still, the artifacts remained sootprint, tire cast, purse, Polaroid, journal, ledger, each one a fragment of truth, stitched together by one mother who refused to look away. On her wall, the ledger photocopy hung at the center of the network section. Its coded entry remained fixed, numbers written in neat black ink. Beside the initials EB, the amount read $500. By 2018, nearly 2 decades had passed. The Harper trailer was long gone, the land sold, the scars of fire covered by grass, yet in Welch. The absence of 2 girls still lived in every whispered conversation. Time had not softened the wound, it had hardened into silence. Sarah Benton had grown older, her hair gray, her movements slower. Yet she never stepped away from the search. Each year she spoke at vigils. Each year she unfolded the same ledger. Each year she held up Claire's belongings as proof that memory could resist erasure. Among those belongings, one object returned again and again, Claire's scarf, pale blue with frayed edges. It had been folded on her bed the night she vanished. Sarah carried it to vigils, to court hearings, even to television interviews. Over time it had absorbed the scent of candles, rain, and smoke. The scarf became less fabric and more symbol continuity between the living and the missing. The family's house had transformed into an archive. Sarah's corkboard covered one wall of the living room, shoeboxes filled closets, binders stacked in hallways. Younger relatives who grew up in this space learned to navigate around evidence piles as if they were furniture. Birthdays and holidays took place beneath photographs of Claire, her schoolbooks, her scarf. Daniel often worried about the toll. He would sit with Sarah late at night, urging her to rest, but she insisted rest is forgetting. Forgetting is erasure. Her words were steady, not dramatic. For her, vigilance was survival. Other families began to join her. Parents of missing children from neighboring counties attended vigils, holding up photos of their own daughters and sons. They formed a small network of survivors, bonded not by recovery, but by absence. Sarah shared her methods, notebooks, timelines, evidence preservation. She became a reluctant teacher, showing others how to keep records when systems failed. At a vigil in Welch in December 2018, candles lined the church steps. Sarah stood with Claire's scarf draped over her shoulders. She read aloud fragments from the journal, then displayed the redacted police report. Her voice was steady as she said, "We survive by remembering. We survive by refusing silence." Children who had not been born when Claire vanished now lit candles of their own. Teenagers whispered her name as though it were myth. The community had grown around absence, and absence had shaped them. That same year, investigators finally moved. A witness, aging and terminally ill, came forward. He spoke of Roy Bissett bragging about the fire, the Polaroids, the girls. His testimony became the anchor for an indictment, for Sarah. It was confirmation of what she had carried all along. Yet even in the moment of progress, the survival of memory mattered more than the trial itself. For nearly 20 years, it was not law enforcement that kept the case alive. It was a mother's record, a family's refusal to let silence win. Inside Sarah's archive, one forensic artifact remained untouched since the first search Claire's scarf. She had submitted fibers for testing years earlier. The report came back, noting smoke exposure, faint traces of accelerant, and nothing more. The scarf was returned folded neatly in an envelope. Sarah kept it sealed for years, then opened it one night, laying the fibers across her table. She ran her hand over the fabric, feeling both fragility and weight. She added a note to her ledger, scarf tested. Fibers retain smoke, still carries scent. At the next vigil, she carried it again. Its edges brushed candle flames as she passed, threads catching light. People reached out to touch it, as though touching it meant touching the past. In that scarf lived the persistence of survival, not of the girls, who never returned, but of those left behind. Survivors were not only people, they were objects, artifacts, memories preserved against all odds. The fire had consumed a home, but it had not consumed a scarf. The fibers held smoke years after the fire was gone. In April 2018, the courthouse in Craig County filled with a silence heavier than noise after years of erasure. One name finally entered the docket, Roy Bissett. He was older now, thin, gray, a man whose bravado had worn into rasping breath, yet in the eyes of the Benton family. He remained the figure Sarah had written about for nearly 2 decades. The indictment was not sweeping. Many charges had dissolved with time, with vanished evidence, with dead witnesses. But what remained was enough to bring him before a judge. The courtroom atmosphere was less victory than reckoning. Reporters whispered. Families of other missing children filled benches. Sarah sat in the front row, Claire's scarf folded in her lap. Prosecutors outlined the case, the fire at the Harper trailer, the disappearance of Emily Harper and Claire Benton, the rumors of captivity, the Polaroids passed between men as trophies. They read from depositions, each line delivered with clinical detachment. The most haunting testimony came from a man once close to the suspects. He described seeing photographs, young girls tied, frightened, lit by flash. He said Bissett had shown them as proof of control. When asked if he recognized the girls, he answered, voice cracking, "Yes, Claire and Emily." The gallery shifted in silence. Sarah gripped the scarf tighter. Court exhibits included fragments. Sarah had preserved photocopies of Claire's journal, records of destroyed vehicles, the transcript of the anonymous call. The defense objected. calling them unreliable. But the judge allowed them for context. For Sarah, it was vindication that her decades of archiving had not been in vain. No Polaroids were shown in court. They remained sealed, locked in evidence lockers, referenced but unseen. Prosecutors described them, line by line. As the jury listened, words replaced images, but the effect was the same. The gallery held its breath. The defense portrayed Bissett as a scapegoat, a sick man blamed for unsolved mysteries. They pointed to vanished evidence, to missing suspects like the McCary cousins, to years of delay, yet the accumulation of fragments proved heavier than doubt. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Their verdict returned guilty of accessory to kidnapping and murder. The sentence was years in prison, reduced by age and health. It was not enough to balance 2 decades of absence, but it was recognition written in legal ink. Sarah left the courthouse without celebration. Reporters asked for her reaction. She answered with one sentence, "Justice without recovery is only paper." Weeks later, Bissett was transferred to state prison. Months later, news arrived that he had died in custody. No final confession, no new revelations. His silence left the same absence he had helped create for the Benton family. The trial was both end and continuation. It confirmed what Sarah had built in ledgers and corkboards. It acknowledged the truth of captivity and photographs. But it gave no closure, no gravesite, no return of daughters. In the years that followed, Sarah donated portions of her archive to historical records. The soot footprint photograph, the purse, the tire cast. The journal photocopies all entered collections under the label The Welch Girl's Case. She kept the scarf, the original journal, and her notebooks. Those would never leave her home. The trial became a reference point, cited in articles and reports about unsolved crimes, about community persistence, about family-led investigations. Sarah spoke rarely. When she did, her words were cold and factual. She described the evidence, the failures, the gaps. She never speculated. In the courthouse basement, the official exhibit list remained stored in a file. Entry 17 described the most chilling item: recovered Polaroid photographs, content sealed. Described in testimony, no public eyes would ever see them. The case was closed. The record remained. The images remained sealed in an evidence locker, unseen by all. The courthouse lights dimmed, the verdict filed, the press dispersed. Officially, the case was over. The state had secured a conviction, the files bore stamps of closure, and the suspect was buried under prison dirt. Yet in Welch, the absence remained. Closure in law was not closure in life. Sarah Benton lived in a house that had become a repository of 2 decades. Her living room walls still bore string lines, photographs, and notes. The corkboard had been replaced twice, each larger than the last. Shoeboxes sat in stacks along the hall. On her table rested the fireproof box containing Claire's journal. Wrapped scarf, and the photocopies she had guarded from erasure. Visitors sometimes expected relief after the trial. Instead, they found a quiet heavier than before. Sarah would lead them to her wall, point to the soot footprint photograph, the purse, the journal entry trailing into smudged ink. She would say, "This is the record. This is what we still don't have." Community vigils continued. Each December, candles lined the church steps, each flame a reminder of absence. New generations who had not known Emily or Claire grew up with their names spoken each year. Their photographs remained on posters, fading but reprinted, taped to poles, pinned on bulletin boards. For Sarah, the aftermath was less about justice than preservation. She feared forgetting more than she feared the suspects. She created a final ledger labeled Aftermath. Its pages contained not evidence but consequences the marriages strained. The siblings who grew up in shadows, the neighbors who left town, the children born into stories of disappearance. The ledger also documented herself. Medical notes, hospital visits, the toll of years spent in search. She recorded these with the same precision as tire tracks and hair samples for her. The personal was forensic. The body, a site of evidence, showing what absence did to those left behind. Younger relatives carried fragments forward. Claire's cousins gave school presentations about the case, holding up photocopies of the missing posters. One nephew joined law enforcement, citing the case as his reason. Others avoided the subject entirely, moving away, refusing to speak of Welch. The case fractured not only a community, but a lineage. In 2019, Sarah was invited to a university lecture on criminal justice reform. She brought with her the scarf, laid it across the podium. Students leaned forward as she spoke. Her voice flat. Systems fail, families do not. If you want to know why cases close, study the gaps. The answers live there. Her words entered transcripts, later quoted in articles about family-led investigations. Yet she never sought audience. Her purpose remained singular: to keep Claire's presence from dissolving. The official archive held courtroom transcripts, redacted reports, and sealed exhibits. But Sarah's archive was different, human, fragile, assembled from persistence. The soot print photograph, the plaster cast, the purse, the journal, the scarf. Each piece spoke louder than reports. By 2020, Sarah's health declined. Daniel took over parts of the archive, labeling, scanning, preserving. He promised to maintain it, to keep the ledger intact, on her bedside table. Sarah kept only the scarf, threads frayed, scent long faded, but the fabric still carried smoke. The community held a vigil when she passed. They placed the scarf on a chair left empty in the front row. Candles flickered, casting shadows across fabric. For many, it was the first time they understood that the case was not only about two missing girls, it was about the woman who refused silence, who built a record that outlasted the men who tried to erase it. Her ledgers entered archives, stored under protective glass. Researchers studied them as examples of persistence, of what families could do when institutions failed. But no record, no trial, no archive returned Emily and Claire. They remained where they had always been absent, in Welch. The fire was still remembered. People passing the road at night glanced toward the field, half expecting to see the glow again. Children growing up heard stories not of monsters in the dark, but of neighbors who disappeared. The case became myth and warning both, and in the archives. Sarah's handwriting remained steady, date after date, entry after entry, culminating in one final page, 2 words written in black ink, unshaken even at the end. Still missing.